Welcome to the Manhattan Institute's virtual event cast. This one we're calling Reporting Right, How Conservative Journalists Are Doing Local News. I'm Michael Hendricks, Director of State and Local Policy here at MI. At least 1,800 communities across the country have no local news media. It's astonishing. They're basically news deserts. And whatever you think of the media, studies basically say the same thing. These news deserts are bad. They're bad for you, they're bad for your neighbors, and they're especially bad for local governance. But there are green shoots in these deserts. New outlets emerging with watchdog reporters and national journalists devoting their attention to local issues. So today we're going to talk to those reporters and journalists. Now, as we go, please enter your questions on whatever platform you're watching us on, and I'll incorporate them into the discussion as we go. All right, first up, Ted Dabrowski of Wirepoints in Illinois. Wirepoints regularly breaks news on corruption in the Windy City and elsewhere, all sorts of local stories and national in Chicago. We're also proud to welcome Albert Eisenberg of Broad and Liberty in Philadelphia, a digital media enterprise and think tank covering local and current issues with an eye toward improving civic dialogue. And last but not least, we're immensely grateful to be joined by Jillian Milcher from the Wall Street Journal's editorial page. Thank you all for joining us today. Albert, I want to start with you. Why should we care about local journalism, and why Broad and Liberty?
Well, thanks, Michael, and thanks to the Manhattan Institute for hosting this important, timely, overdue conversation. We should care because I think everybody watching this understands that the media has gone woke by and large, which means that they're no longer living in reality. And people who care about reality need to have the stories and the opinions and perspectives and voices that reflect reality. And a lot of our civic culture, not just our politics, has gone berserk because the existing incumbent outlets have abandoned reality. So with Broad and Liberty, which viewers can see right there, you can go to broadandliberty.com. It was myself and a few co-founders in the greater Philadelphia region, the cradle of liberty, but an area that is a self-created news desert where there are active outlets that have decided and opted not to report on things such as the crime rate spiking and why the quote unquote progressive DA might be responsible for that, how taxes and soda tax and other items might affect people's lives. They've just abandoned reality. So we decided to found an outlet that properly reflected that and that would actually speak truth to power, which is the language you hear echoed so often by people who are really just echoing cliches. So if you care about solutions, if you care about reaching an audience in areas where the conservative movement or the national right has sort of abandoned ship but needs to re-enter, you need to support, read, fund outlets like ours and like Wirepoints and like the Wall Street Journal editorial page. So that's why I think it really matters.
Albert, just to stay with you for a moment, we can talk about news deserts being, and they're traditionally defined as places where you just don't have much in the way of local media, if at all. You're talking about in Philadelphia, and we're going to cover Chicago as well. You're talking about Philadelphia as a place that does have newspapers, TV stations, all that. It's not a traditionally defined news desert. But would you say that there's another kind of news desert where just there's a lot of stories that aren't being covered? Fine, You may have outlets, but the stories aren't being covered in the way they should.
Yes, and I'll give an example. So the term food desert does not mean that there's no calories available. It means that there's junk food available. In Philadelphia, we have junk media that's available. For example, the Philadelphia Inquirer, which is sort of the main publication, the woke publication in town. We have a pretty important story in Pennsylvania, like New York State and like Connecticut, actually not Connecticut, like New Jersey. We required COVID patients to go into nursing homes, which ended up spreading like wildfire. And Pennsylvania had one of the highest proportions of COVID deaths in nursing homes. The Philadelphia Inquirer still has not reported that last April, our Secretary of Health moved her mother out of one such facility into a fancy hotel right as she signed on to this order that forced COVID patients into nursing homes, which ended up killing tens of thousands of people. So that's news desert. That is like, you are not reporting a serious story that's involving scores of deaths. And we all know if the shoe was on the other foot, if the party was different, they would have been all over this story. That is where there is a huge market niche that we seek to fill.
Well, and this goes beyond partisanship. You're talking about real stories, the kind of investigative journalism and watchdog reporting that outlets have traditionally done, but maybe doing less of for a variety of reasons. Ted, I want to get to you. Similar question to you just at the outset. What is Wirepoints, and what sort of stories do you find yourself covering?
Yeah, so we're an independent, nonpartisan group, and we're dedicated to telling the truth in Illinois, which is a big deal. Anybody who's following Illinois knows that we've got the lowest credit rating in the country. We've got the biggest pension crisis in the country, one of the biggest outmigration of people in the country. So we're in deep pain. But if you're listening to Illinois politicians, they'll always tell you things are okay. We just need one more tax hike to fix things. Our goal is to be the fiscal realists in Illinois and tell the stories that others aren't telling. In particular, we start with finances and the economic condition because we are such laggards in the country. And so what we do and what we have expertise in is actually looking at the numbers, both at the state level and local level. We're able to open up CAFRs, financial documents, and tell the real story behind what's going on. Illinois has become really expensive to live in. There aren't enough good paying jobs, and our governments are really corrupt. And people have a difficult time connecting the dots between the plight of their cities, the difficulties they're having, and the policies at work. And so we're good at grabbing those fiscal issues, those economic issues, breaking it down by city, by school district, whether it's pension problems or whether it's the property taxes, highest property taxes in the country. We break it all down for people and then let people consume it across the state in the way that they can. And we try to make it, of course, as marketing centric as possible. But people need to know the truth about what's happening. And that's our goal, is to call it like it is, be straight talking, and people can figure out much more about what's impacting their lives.
Ted, I mean, it sounds roughly similar to the kind of explanatory journalism that you come across, at least is the pitch for an outlet like Vox. How would you categorize Wirepoints? Who would you say across an ideological spectrum, although I know you're not partisan, where would you, what would be other outlets similar to yours or that would be inspiring to the kind of Wirepoints approach?
Well, I tell you, we're very data centric. We try to avoid right and left where we can because we're trying to just use reason, logic, data, and persuasion. And we always argue that if we can't win our arguments with those, then we're not doing it right. It's our fault. And so, it's I don't know who's doing it like us because we're super data heavy. We want, every time we make a claim, we want to have a chart right next to it to prove our point. And we love to be challenged on our data. That's a big part of it. But without that data, it just becomes rhetoric. And so, we hope others are inspired to follow us in terms of the way we use data. We're comfortable with data. Not everybody is. And I think that's a big problem. But it's why, when COVID hit, we actually moved from the financial to the COVID. We're one of the few groups in Illinois to actually talk about COVID, publish COVID data every day. And people loved it because we're willing to give a different narrative than what the government was giving about exactly how COVID was playing out.
Speaking of data, Jillian, I hope we all know what Wall Street Journal is. I think one of the more impressive aspects of Wall Street Journal has been its local coverage. Although even that is difficult these days. It's tough to stay up on the greater New York stories, even for the Wall Street Journal. So, but so far this year, you've written on Seattle, the border, and years back, just all across the country. What would you say is the Wall Street Journal's approach to covering local news beyond the big cities of New York, LA, San Francisco?
Well, it's certainly a priority for us. We've got a column called Cross Country, and it really does aim to be cross country. Look, I think a lot of the national media makes the mistake of thinking that New York, DC, and Los Angeles are the most important parts of the country. And they are important in terms of politics, finance, and culture. But there's a lot happening outside of that. And I think you miss national trends if you don't pay attention to the local. There's a saying that, all politics is personal. Well, all politics is fundamentally local, I think, too. So that's been an area of priority for me. I come from a local news background first and foremost, out in Cheyenne, Wyoming. That's where I really cut my teeth as a young journalist. And it's been really interesting for me when you get out of that sort of Beltway, East Coast, West Coast scene. The issues affecting people aren't what the major media is seeing. I think they've got a blind spot on this. So some of that local coverage actually helps inform my national coverage. I'll give you an example, just reporting in the last year on policing, looking at what's happening in Seattle and Portland and Minneapolis. These are significant issues. We saw how much of an impact this can have on culture, but following the day-to-day, following some of the issues that are underpinning this over the course of many years, whether it's city council, whether it's federal oversight of police departments, it's easy to see suddenly how these issues explode onto the national scene. And I think it's really important to pay attention to them beforehand.
Right, and not just being surprised when suddenly you hear about it in the halls of Congress. This is something that's been bubbling up for a long time. And I can also see how, having reporters, having op-ed folks, yes, based in New York, based in DC, that's valuable, but also having them out in the rest of the country, not only for reporting that local news, but maybe even having a different perspective on national news or a different perspective on what's happening on the Potomac. Maybe you get a different perspective when you're out, say, on the West Coast or Alaska or somewhere else on what's happening back in DC. So just to go back to something that you mentioned earlier, you started in Cheyenne, Wyoming. You started out studying journalism in Wyoming, not Washington, not New York. Mm-hmm. How have you seen the local media landscape change and shift since you got into the trade? I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I started out, I went to a community college before I went to four-year college. We had a very local emphasis. We took pride in our student paper when we could scoop the local paper, the Wyoming Tribune Eagle. But I also got to do local radio. And I think that looking back on my career, that was a really formative experience. We realized that we needed to call up city councilors. I remember getting up while it was still dark out, trying to get a morning show together, waking up people to talk about what had happened at the city council meeting the night before, but also just the preparation that goes into that. I think as a young journalist, it's a really good thing to have to follow some of the things that you'd consider boring because they have a huge impact on people's lives. These are the school board meetings. These are small taxation issues. This is going through the budget. And I think that as a young journalist, as you've seen more and more newspapers close, Penn's looking at this. They just did a report not that long ago. Since 2004, which is about the time I was doing really local journalism in Wyoming, 1,800 newspapers just gone, 200 communities that don't have any local publication. And that's important for good governance because, I think corruption flourishes when you have no scrutiny, no public accountability. But that's also a really important skill for young journalists to have. And I think the temptation right now is for them to begin their career looking nationally. And you really miss some of those hard investigative reporting skills that serve you well, whether it's at a national, state, or local level. That's really key training, I think. And I unfortunately think that you end up with two things as a result of that. You end up with local communities where there's a lot more malfeasance, a lot more corruption, a lot more sort of silly, unaccountable local politics. But I also think you end up with national news that has not the skills to look at some of these issues in depth as they should. And that because of that national focus, writes in a bubble. They've never been exposed to those ideas that are outside of the Beltway. And I think both of those things are bad for our society. One, because scrutiny is really important. Second, because, if you don't have that diversity of viewpoints, if you don't have that diversity of perspectives, you end up with a true blind spot.
Mm. Well, I feel like this is a great segue to you, Albert. How have you seen the local media landscape change? How does it help or even hurt outlets like yours with kind of new reporting and editorial coverage to emerge?
Well, there's a really interesting split. It's not just New York City and DC and San Francisco versus the rest of the country, because Jillian mentions that it's a really important distinction. But even within Philadelphia or within New York City or within Chicago, you have neighborhoods where it's sort of woke progressive that are being very well served by the current media outlets, which have basically pledged allegiance to these new ideologies in the last year or two. And then you take what is being written and covered and you take it to an average working class neighborhood of literally any racial or ethnic background. And the people there are not in tune with this. So that is the market opportunity right now. It's not just, we don't want our news dictated from New York City and DC, but like people in Queens don't want their news to be only from Tony elites in Manhattan. So it's kind of like even within cities, and in Chicago, you could say like there's the Evanston woke vibe, and then there's the South Side of Chicago, where people are living in reality and they're living the reality of what this type of governance means. So I mean, I think that's a really important distinction, and that's a market opportunity for us. So
that's so fascinating, because I mean, I feel like this data is a little out of date, but I seem to recall something like a third of reporting journalists were concentrated in just 3 cities: DC, New York, and LA. And again, this is a little out of date. I'm sure it's become even more concentrated. Maybe back in 2004, I think it was around a quarter. So now it's a third. And then who knows when it'll be half of reporting journalists concentrated in just 3 cities. But you also make a great point too. We've seen even in New York, a lot of local rags, hyper-local rags, neighborhood-based reporting outlets just disappear or get bought up by larger companies, and more or less die away. But I can't imagine that somebody living in the outer boroughs of New York has at all a similar experience, or maybe the same concerns as someone who lives in a really Tony neighborhood in some part of Upper West Side or Upper East Side. And if that's true in New York, I can only imagine what it's like in other cities. Ted, I mean, what's your sense of how the internet's maybe, it's kind of a related question, what's your sense of how the internet has maybe lowered barriers to entry for outlets like yours? In one sense, the digital age has been a disaster for the local media business, for their business models. But on the other hand, it's easier than ever for new outlets to emerge, even if the funding question is still hard. So yeah, what's that been like for you? How do you see it?
Yeah, so a little bit of the previous question. If you look at local coverage, it's really hard for whoever's left of the traditional media, because they're trying to cover everything, and it's just maybe one person who's also the camera person. It's just too much, and so what you're missing is the ability to cover a school board meeting in detail. School board meetings can take 3 to 4 to 5 hours. You never know. The data is complex. You don't know how to challenge, what a school board says, for example, or city council says, and so. The onset of social media and technology makes it really easy for anybody to follow, anybody to report something. By the same token, it's really hard, as we get more complex, it's really hard to follow exactly what governments are doing. And so, the fact is anybody can cover it, but you have to have the expertise, especially if you want to look at financial issues, economic issues. And that's where a group like ours has a benefit, because we're focused on finances. We can actually take data from the entire state locally and give each city the specific data it needs. And so it really opens up the door for us to be experts on things, even though it opens up the door for everybody else. If I can give a quick example.
Please.
The big discussion, one of the big discussions we've had across the nation's BLM and defunding. But what's interesting is that we're going to put out a short piece on defunding the police, but it has nothing to do with BLM. It has to do with local pension costs, which are going so high that it's forcing cities to fund police pensions, but they can't fund the active policemen themselves, and so they're firing policemen to fund city pensions. And so you've got a defunding going on city by city, and so we can highlight which cities those are, how many policemen they've lost, what share of their police space they're losing, and how that's impacting each city. And it's a powerful ability to do that, but that would be hard in the non-internet age, because we'll be able to publish this stuff and get it out there to as many people as possible.
Do you find that there's probably a grassroots element to this? Your readers benefit, I believe, from the data you're providing them. But do you also find that other outlets benefit from the reporting that you're doing? In other words, do you find other local outlets taking the data that you're reporting on and running with it and producing their own stories?
Oh yeah, I mean that's precisely the idea. We don't have enough of the distribution for everybody to see it, and so we have the local papers. If we publish the data in a way that's consumable, you'll get other newspapers just grabbing it, taking their core data from their city. It might be a hyper local paper. They'll grab that data and publish it. So we'll have websites republish our work. We'll have smaller newspapers, the local TV, and it's a really powerful method. As long as we can distribute the information and cut it up into pieces that are consumable and usable by local press, then it's been really successful that way.
I feel like what you're describing is a media ecosystem. So it's one thing to say, fine, there's still at least one newspaper left in a certain city, that's not the same as a vibrant media ecosystem where reporters are competing with one another. You have different outlets competing with each other, maybe feeding each other storylines. I find that fascinating. And also, this gets to a question that just came from the audience. If there's a thriving media ecosystem for reporting, then potentially there's a much deeper talent market. You're able to tap into a lot of different people from different backgrounds. This is a question from Emma in our audience. She says she's an aspiring fashion journalist, but believes that working in fashion journalism today, she must espouse progressive, what she calls progressive cliches. So she asks, as a registered independent with a libertarian streak, I truly don't know how to pursue journalism in this environment. Jillian, I just want to start with you. I wonder how, as someone coming out of journalism school, kind of getting to her question, how did you approach the marketplace in journalism, and how would you advise others approaching that marketplace, considering how it is changing? And especially, by the way, I'll just add, especially if you maybe think differently than the consensus.
Well, Emma, first of all, I've got to say, I love your question. I love following fashion, and that's part of what got me interested in journalism to begin with. I remember in high school reading Vogue and just being completely mesmerized by it. And even though the politics were different than the ones I espouse, it opened up my mind to a broader world. So glad other people are out there paying attention to it. I guess what I'd say is, if you're feeling like there's no place for you in fashion, you can sure bet that a lot of women are feeling that way, that they're fed up with the idea that in order to enjoy something that is universal, that they have to espouse specific political viewpoints. And I think that's kind of a risk of our super nationalized, super polarized media environment, that it is polarizing, that it does kind of pressure people into a niche that they don't fit into and doesn't have a lot of tolerance for diversity of viewpoints. So I guess what I'd say is, I think there's a market for what you're interested in. It's up to you to find it. I ended up in opinion journalism in part because I knew that if I was going to end up reporting the stories that I wanted in a way that I felt was honest, that I needed to be upfront with my readers about where I was coming from. But I'm also really thankful to a place like the Wall Street Journal that carves out space for that. In the same way that I think they do a really good job, not just focusing on the coasts. It's a opinion page that has a diversity of opinions. So I think there is a space for you here. It's just a matter of finding it. But I do think that market exists.
Albert, turning to you, you are a kind of a digitally oriented media outlet. You also do other work, think tanks, consulting, all sorts of other things. So, in one sense, the digital revolution has been beneficial to what you are doing. On the other hand, the digital revolution has also taken a lot of the ad revenue that had sustained traditional local media, and even in also nationalized news. So you didn't have local monopolies either in ad dollars or even on the news itself. So this is really a double-edged sword. So now there's a lot of talk about saying, well, is there a way to redirect that revenue that a Google or a Facebook are absorbing back to local outlets? How do you see that question about the role of big tech in journalism helping, hurting, and what it means for your bottom line? What if you have thoughts on that?
Well, there's a lot to discuss within that issue. I would say, I hope I've established there is a market opportunity. I think as the local journalism especially has gone sort of woke, it has left reality for most people. So me and my business partners came together and we thought, okay, there's a market opportunity. There are stories that can be told. There are voices that need to be heard. And then we can offer a public service for young journalists like Emma, for example, for investigative reporters, for editorial voices, for people who are not feeling heard or not feeling like they have a space to contribute and thrive and share their perspectives without being, bullied or canceled or what have you. So we thought there would be a virtuous cycle when we founded our publication in 2019. And like Wirepoints, we founded as a nonprofit journalism outlet. We are supported by individual small donors, perhaps some of them that are listening right now. We're supported by large institutional donors that feel a desire to cultivate a free-thinking media outlet in the heart of a city that has kind of gone off the deep end, but that affects Philadelphia, affects the course of Pennsylvania, the Keystone State, affects the course of New Jersey, and it actually affects the nation. If anyone follows politics knows that Pennsylvania is the Keystone State for a reason. So we founded ourselves as a nonprofit, which offers us a lot of flexibility, and we stick to our mission of, informing people more broadly and giving voice to perspectives and stories that are shut out right now. And we think we are doing a pretty good job. We pledge to be different, to be open, not just, conservative right-wing rag, but we are open to basically any voice that isn't welcome in the woke media. And that includes center left, that includes far left, that includes the center. So I do think that with the digital age opening up, basically there's a huge market, there's a lot of opportunity, but what you need is, instead of all the people that open their newspaper every morning and roll their eyes and just throw it out or cancel their subscriptions, those people need to either come together and found their own institutions in their respective home cities and metropolitan areas, or they need to fund people who are willing to do this.
I do want to stay on this funding and business model question a little bit. So Ted, I wonder if you have thoughts. It sounds like your approach is similar to Albert's.
Yeah, it's similar. A big thing that we're trying to do at Wirepoints is like you mentioned, a bigger ecosystem. We need to work within the other news outlets that are trying to spread the message. Well, we need fiscal responsibility, we need better economics, and of course, the cultural issue's gotten huge in Illinois. We're leading that in many ways with a lot of the laws we're passing, and I mean that negatively. We're going to extreme levels, far further than any central left, certainly the right would want. And so, there's a big opportunity. We haven't mentioned local radio, but local radio is still a huge thing, and it's something that we try to work on to make sure that our message is spread through radio. It's a thing that's we cancel compared to the big tech. So that's one. We've had other discussions about using billboards, things like that, other ways to reach people, and of course, one of the things we do is research, and as long as we do research that's data-based, factual, not hyperbolic, both sides of the aisle will take it because they're looking for news, they're looking for data, they're looking for reporting, and so to the extent that we can feed the ecosystem, that works. And when I say all that, because funders who are looking for better news outlets or better research or data like what we're doing, and they're willing to support us in what we're doing, and in terms of both content creation as well as the social media and other things that go with that. And so we're finding quite a few people who are hungry for the voice that we have, and they're willing to support us. And I think that's the case. I think it'll be more and more the case, especially if the big tech keeps stepping up like they're doing and blocking things and canceling things. Then you're going to see the counter to that from wealthy people who want to see a more open media.
That's fascinating. So you do have a nonprofit approach, and that nonprofit business model for certain outlets seems like a very productive one. I'm also glad that you brought up how there are different kinds of local media. It's not just newspapers, it's TV, it's radio, it's NPR as well. Just to put my cards on the table, you'll notice like I am focusing a little bit more on newspapers or the digital versions of newspapers. From my angle, it seems like the medium constrains or informs the message. So if you only have the opportunity to have quick 30-second sound bites on television, just because of the medium, newspaper, digital, and print gives a little more space to unpack a story and let it breathe. And I think that's important. But that's not to say that different kinds of outlets can't be complementary to one another, maybe even cooperate, maybe even help each other find a way to either profitability or to just staying afloat and flourishing. Jillian, I wonder if you just have any thoughts on this. Wall Street Journal was one of the first traditional print outlets to establish a paywall, and it seems like that was a very successful approach. Can you just unpack a little bit more about how Wall Street Journal and from your perspective, at least, approaches this question?
Well, I'm really fortunate. So at the Wall Street Journal, our news side, our opinion side, and our business side are really separate. We joke that it's church and state. And that gives me a lot of freedom into what I report on and what I explore. I'm not dealing with concerns about advertisers being unhappy. I'm not concerned about the business side of it. I can just do my job. Not everybody's that lucky. Certainly, other media really has to worry about that bottom line. But I do think that one thing I've found consistently throughout my career is that there is a market for good reporting. There's a lot of fluff out there. There's a lot of opinion. There's a lot of baseless conjecture. But the people who are really willing to get in the trenches to file Freedom of Information Act requests, to go out and build sources to break news, to hold public officials accountable in a way that is fact-based and rigorous, I think there's always a market for that. So I'm really happy to see a flourishing sort of new wave of people who are focused on this local level, because I think there's such an opportunity in the absence of local papers to do that really hard work. And it does get attention and it does really matter.
That's such a great point. Even if local media outlets are going away, that's not to say, even if the supply of local media is decreasing, that doesn't mean the demand is necessarily decreasing. I think that's an important point. To our audience, please continue to submit questions, and I'll wrap them in as we go. Have them ready. Don't be shy about it. Don't hold back. Shifting gears a little bit, this event is called Reporting Right. So, Albert, I want to get back to you for a moment. You talk a lot about woke journalism. I want you to unpack that. What do you mean when you say woke journalism, and what specifically can or are conservatives bringing to bear on local journalism?
Well, I think just having a diversity of perspectives and sort of competition of ideas improves reality and the practical repercussions of policymaking. I mean, woke journalism is journalism that no longer will allow voices and perspectives to be heard that don't fit a certain dogma. And I think, any observer of politics and culture over the last few decades has seen a shift from what you'd call a classical liberal mentality of, the best idea will win. Maybe we lean left, maybe we lean right, but let's, get the perspectives out there, to one that seeks to kind of control the argument, indoctrinate readers or listeners rather than inform them. I think that's a key distinction. And you have woke media, issuing statements specifically around like the George Floyd killing and the, BLM protests after, where there's no room for nuance. There's no room for discussion on these certain major fundamental issues of American society that have huge differences of opinions, even, not just among white Philadelphians, not just among Black Philadelphia. I mean, you have huge diversity of opinion of what, what are the problems that are ailing us and what are the solutions. If you're not willing as an institution, as a publication, to give voice to perspectives that diverge from what your kind of like fringe perspective, I would call it an elite perspective, is, you are a woke publication and you're no longer dedicated to seeking out truth. You're dedicated to indoctrination. So readers of certain publications in Philadelphia can get their morning dose of, okay, here's what I'm supposed to think every morning. They can say, okay, here's how fashion is perpetually racist, and here's how this monument that's on our corner actually has a horrible history, and here's how this food is problematic, and here's how, as a woman, you're oppressed. You can get all that. That is very much open to readers and viewers of, Philadelphia local media. What they can't get is diverging perspectives and solutions and ideas that might challenge viewpoints like that. I don't know if that quite addressed your...
Yeah, Jillian, I see you leaning in a little bit and nodding your head. I wonder if you have thoughts on this.
Yes, I think that's a really important question to ask. And one of the things that I'm disturbed about the trend in journalism right now is you have a lot of activists who are parading as journalists. The fundamental point of journalism is to seek the truth. It's not to tell a narrative or advance it. It's to seek after the truth and report it as you see it. Accuracy is really important, but I just see again and again journalists behaving like activists, and that's extraordinarily disturbing. But I think also to the point of news and opportunity, it creates blind spots, and I'll just come back to that. I'll give you two examples on this. So I think right now we're seeing an explosion of concerns about K through 12 education, about the curriculum. Now, if you've been paying attention to what's been happening in higher education, that's not surprising. I remember in 2015, the protests at the University of Missouri, which I think really set the tone for a lot of where activism is right now. Everybody was focusing on one narrative. We sent out a public records request and ended up going through about, I want to say like 5,000 pages. And doing that hard work of actually digging into the records and the data showed a story that nobody was telling. What it basically showed was that when administration caved to the most radical voices on campus, there was widespread discontent that those radical voices did not speak for the majority of campus, that many students felt too intimidated to take them on, but that parents, that donors, that alumni, that sports fans were all dropping out and protesting through the market. I remember looking at this one email that a longtime sports fan had sent into the University of Missouri saying, "I'm so disappointed in what you've done. I have all this swag. I'm getting rid of it. I'm never coming back to your sports game again." So I think what that opened my eyes to is that people really care about this. That's University of Missouri. It's still a local issue. But I think right now when we shift it to school boards, a lot of major publications have been completely shocked that there's been parent pushback to a social justice education, to taking those same higher ed ideas and putting them in K through 12 education. And that's not a surprise if you've been doing the hard work and paying attention to that local reporting over the course of many years. And I think that them having that blind spot, while conservatives are maybe willing to fill that void, helps you get ahead of the news, helps you anticipate what it might be in a couple of years. So that's really important.
Jillian, another question from the audience. What do you think has been the most important local story that you've covered in your time at Wall Street Journal? To tell us about that and why you think it was important.
Well, I have a lot of stories that I think are important, but I'll focus on one that is particularly close to my heart. And it actually started at National Review and has continued on to the Wall Street Journal. But I remember seeing in Philadelphia that there was a Quaker meeting house that had been burnt down. Arson was suspected. And I just thought that was so weird. Like, who burns down a Quaker meeting house? They're the nicest people. But as I started looking into it, what I started discovering was that this Quaker meeting house had used non-union labor. And they ended up going and blowtorching it to the ground. And so looking into that story ended up leading to a series on how the building trades unions in Philadelphia were using violence, vandalism, and intimidation to really capture the market in a way that wasn't fair. And that story has been rewarding to cover over the course of many years. You had several leaders in one union end up getting convicted under like a RICO-like statute, sort of what you would use to go against organized crime. You have another one who's indicted right now, and the court proceedings on that are starting to play out. But I think that's a really important story. And by the way, I'm not saying that I'm the only person who's covered this. Philadelphia Inquirer has actually done a really good job on this specific local story. But I think it was important because drawing attention to this story at the time that I did and that they did ended up drawing public scrutiny to the fact that something was going on here that wasn't right and that was actually very violent. And I think it made a difference. So it's a story I'm really proud of.
Albert, I actually know that you have some questions that you'd like to ask Ted. So this is actually a great chance for journalists to talk to other journalists. Albert, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, first I'd like to say I am 3/4 Jewish and 1/4 Quaker, Pennsylvania Quaker. So I think, Jillian, you're right. It's a peaceable quarter of my genealogy for sure. Ted, I mean, I think about this a lot with founding a media outlet of, what is the definition of change and there's theories of change, there's theories of success. You guys do such a good job at being concrete with your agenda. So what does success and change look like in Chicago and Illinois for Wirepoints?
Yeah, for me, it's a little bit easy. Before I came back to the U.S. about 14 years ago, I was in Warsaw, Poland, and I worked there for 9 years. And so that was all about, I got there in 1998, so not long after the wall came down in Germany. And it was all about working together to deconstruct that socialist communist model they had and to have one of growth and catching up with the Western world and attracting business and investment in people. And it was a fascinating experience because everybody was working together towards one goal, and that was to make Poland a viable, growing country again. And so when I came back to the States, I came back to Chicago and Illinois, and my parents, when they came here, they're both immigrants. My dad from Poland and my mom from Ecuador. They came to Chicago. They came to Illinois. This is like one of the beacons of the world. And everybody was coming from all over the world. They were coming from the South and the Great Migration. And so this was it. Well, I left and they came back 40 years later. And we were no longer, not where we just no longer the beacon. We were losing more people than virtually every other state. To other states, we've shrunk. We were one of the 3 states to shrink in the country in the last decade: West Virginia, Mississippi, and Illinois. And so, it's easy for me to think about what our goal is. Our goal is to make Illinois a vibrant state again, one where people actually want to stay, settle down, build their roots, invest in their companies, grow their small business, and change the dynamic where people are proud of Illinois. We look at the growth of Tennessee, the Carolinas, of course, Florida and Texas. They're attracting people and investment all the time, like crazy, and we're losing Illinois to those states. There's no reason. Illinois has great assets. It has as great assets as any country in the world. It should be a growing state. And so, I think our vision is to say, hey, we've got to flip the laws eventually. They go from chasing people out to actually prioritizing people, prioritizing investment, and letting people be able to grow and succeed and want to raise their family here. So it's right now it's a pretty easy thing to look at. Is we're losing people. We want to flip that.
Mm. And that's such a marked change from this kind of view from nowhere journalism. You have a view from somewhere, and it's somewhere specific, and it's somewhere with a specific set of ideas and a way of looking at the world that I think is really, really interesting. It's been fascinating to watch this flourishing of ideas and policy think tanks at the state level, particularly on the right, across the country. But at the same time, the local level, there just doesn't seem to be that same kind of infrastructure. One of the things that I found fascinating about what Albert, Ted, what you all are doing is it's in some ways it resembles like a complement to that state policy think tank universe that exists at the state level, but you're taking a different approach. You're not creating think tanks, you're doing reporting. And that could be something that is almost as valuable, if not more valuable, than pumping out white papers, because you're still shaping how people view the world around them. Is that at all how you view it, Albert or Ted, that this is something even more than just reporting? It's bigger.
Yeah, this is hearts and minds. I mean, this is the American public. This is where we are going as a country, and what we decide is our mutual, what is the world around us? And it's interesting you mentioned that. Me and my co-founders came together and pitched this idea, among others, to one such, state level think tank. And these are people who, you can go to Albany, you can go to Tallahassee, you can go to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And these people don't know how to engage in Philadelphia necessarily. And we said, we have an idea, we have a concept. It's not that expensive. So why don't you try us out? And they helped incubate us. And we are evangelists for this. Every, similar state level foundation think tank in the country should be incubating a local media outlet, either formally or back channel. It is not enough to send lawmakers the right policies when people are consuming every day on their phones, in their feeds, from all angles, essentially propaganda about the world that is crafted by a very narrow-minded group of people. So, you need to do a lot more, and it needs to be upstream of the policy, outcomes that we want.
Ted, I see you nodding your head.
Yeah, I just want to add to that. I think that's perfectly right. I think I find one addition that I like to add, though, is that the research that a think tank does, and we do research. I don't really call them white papers because they're not as long, as wonky, as complex. We try to provide the data that's really out there in the public. Is just hidden in documents, and just make it easy. And what I think really matters is that research turns into news, right? So one type of news is you're breaking the news because a legislator said something or a new bill is being proposed. Another kind of news is taking the data, crunching it, and putting it out there, and letting the local communities consume it. And you mentioned local TV, and I forgot to mention that, Michael, but you're absolutely right. Local TV is huge. So when you break something like, the U.S. Census put out the outmigration and population data recently. When you break that up for places and provide them with the data, and it's fresh and it's research based, it allows and you message it properly, right? We of course always have a message in what we do, but if you message it properly, the news media will pick it up. The local TV station will actually write the article. They'll actually do a piece exactly the way you want it, not because you tell them how to do it, but because the data says so. And in the radio, you can send that same message there, and the local newspapers will do it too. So it's an integral part to have that commentary, that kind of opinion, again, logic and reason-based, but tied with the data, and then it sells itself. It's just a question of scale and how well you can do it and how often you can do it.
Mm. And Jillian, Wall Street Journal is primarily a print-centric publication, but obviously it has a great digital presence, but it's more than that. You also have a lot of video content that your colleagues put out every week. When you do writing on the op-ed pages, are you thinking just about your piece itself? Or are you thinking more holistically about video, audio, how your colleagues could use it, how it will, maybe whatever you write can be used locally as well? Like, how do you think about your piece more than just an op-ed that you've written?
Well, we're storytellers, right? So one of the things that I've really enjoyed, and thank goodness we have a fantastic team working on this, but I look at the ways that multimedia can enhance the telling of a story. So for instance, when we were writing about some of the tariffs, doing interviews that we recorded and then coming up with a podcast where people were saying, this is how it's impacting me for better or for worse. When we can put that human layer on the hard investigative reporting. There's a story we did a few weeks ago about Seattle. Last summer during the protests, they had an autonomous zone where the police weren't supposed to go. You ended up with a 19-year-old who was shot and killed there. And it looks like there was a delay in paramedics getting to the scene because police couldn't accompany them. Somebody ended up just scooping this kid up, taking him to the hospital in the back of a truck where he passed away. So looking at that story, looking at the records on this, going through some of the police records, but also speaking to his mother, speaking to family members, getting pictures of him as a child, just figuring out a way to combine sort of the nitty-gritty investigative reporting, the really hard database stuff, with something that people can relate to, where if you have an absence of police, this could be your 19-year-old kid that goes out and has this horrific experience. And the people who are paid to help them weren't there. Why is that? It's political reasons. I think combining those two things is really important. And I'm really excited that the media is taking it upon themselves to tell the story in more creative ways. Data is really important. Facts are really important. Stories change minds. And I also will just add, I'm really happy to see conservatives in this space, because I think our view of human nature lends us to be really good investigative reporters. We believe that people will do what they can get away with. We're not necessarily convinced that if left alone, people will do the right thing. And I think that makes us better and more skeptical investigative reporters.
Mm. Well, and Jillian, this is a great time to bring up a question from the audience as well. Maria is asking, do you have any advice for conservative young professionals who are experiencing bullying by woke institutions or workplaces and need to defend themselves? What are your thoughts on that? Journalism does seem like a place that could be a little more difficult for a conservative who's not at a conservative outlet.
Well, first of all, I'm sorry you're going through that. It's rough. If you want the public approval, journalism might not be the right field for you. That said, I tell sources this when they're talking about something that's sensitive, that courage calls to courage. And I think that oftentimes when you speak out, when you express that counterintuitive viewpoint that nobody else is, there are a lot of people who agree with you. They're just too intimidated to say it. So I think in the truest sense, in some ways that is giving a voice to the voiceless, which is a huge part of journalism. Mm-hmm. I would also just say, as far as advice goes, there are a lot of people that can sit down at a computer and rattle off a quick opinion or a hot take on something. There are not a lot of people who can break news. So start looking into things like investigative reporters and editors. They have tip sheets for how to go through budgets, how to break down nonprofit filings, how to go through like labor disclosures, some of the really nitty gritty stuff. And I'll say that if you're good enough of a reporter, if you can break stories that nobody else has that have major state, local, or national significance, I bet your stuff will get published regardless of your political viewpoints.
And I think as we're hearing, there's a lot of those stories now not being covered, especially outside of the really big cities. Albert.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, obviously don't hamstring yourself and don't, start making inflammatory comments or comments that will be perceived as inflammatory. But, we're still in America, and we're not getting carted off into the town square and beheaded quite yet. So make yourself a plan that involves a way to sustain your income and your livelihood and a comfortable place that will be free from, threats to you and your family. And then just try to live honestly, because you only get one go around. And I started being an obnoxious, contrarian, semi-conservative in high school before woke culture had even really formed, but it was already sort of canceling me. And all of these people that are judgmental and closed-minded, they just go with the wind. They're gone. Don't spend too much time online. Just try to live truthfully and freely and read some of the great thinkers of the, Soviet dissidents, Viktor Frankl, and try to be honest, because there's not enough of it. And like Jillian said, when you start being honest, especially if you have, a stable plan, you're not, hamstringing your own life, you will find that the people around you and the people that grow closer and gravitate towards you will be similarly honest and good people.
And also, I'll just add, I loved Christopher Hitchens' letter to a young contrarian. Don't forget about talking to the people that disagree with you. Some of my favorite stories that I've covered in recent years have been when I'm looking at people that are ideologically very different from me. And you'd be surprised how often when you call them up and say, look, here's what I think, prove me wrong, change my mind. I really want to understand where you're coming from. I don't want to be arguing against straw men. You end up with a very intellectually rich discussion, and I think it changes your viewpoint, perhaps changes theirs, but certainly enables you to be a better journalist.
Can I add one more thing?
It works out really well.
Can I add one more thing? This is kind of ironic coming from a digital outlet, somebody representing a digital outlet, but most of these conversations that you get to the heart of the matter and see the other person's heart and their values are in person. And I don't spend that much time on social media except for my clients and for my organization. Talk to your Uber driver. Talk to the lady on the train. Try to get a sense of what actual people are going through, because the people that are dominating the conversation are not representative of what most people are thinking.
Right. It is disappointing when you see news articles that consist of quoted tweets and you think that is not representative of America in any way. Ted, I think just a somewhat different angle on this is that your kind of data-centric approach, there's a connection to, I think, what Jillian was talking about earlier about the market opportunity for hard news, and that no matter your ideology or philosophical background, there's still a real hunger for that kind of news, and that data-centric approach could perhaps, I don't know, do you feel like it breaks down barriers between your readers, between people who may not see the world in the same way that you do?
Oh, I think it's absolutely fascinating. COVID being the example where people have a certain view about COVID, but if you put the numbers in front of them and force them to not force them, that's not the right word, and they're forced to confront that data, they lose their ability to say something. And it's like masks and vaccinations for young people today. We put out a piece the other day where we've had 20 kids under the age of 20 die in Illinois. But when you look at it, you've got 5 times the risk of dying from an accident in Illinois. 10 times the risk of, I forget which other stat, but 2.5 times by cancer. The statistics tell you something entirely different from what the fear and the media tells you. And so our data has been fantastic for breaking down barriers, and people don't know how to bucket us. I think that's the hard part. They want to turn us into conservative, right-wing stuff, but we try not to write that way. We try not to express ourselves. We let the data do the talking, and when you do that, most oftentimes you'll win. Whether it's pensions that are so expensive, you see a multi-million-dollar pension, and you have to ask the average Illinoisan to pay for that multi-million-dollar pension. How do you disagree with how crazy some of the numbers have gotten? But I do want to make one point. The data is critical, but Jillian nails it. You know, stories are critical too. What I like to say about data is that the better your database is, not your database, the better your data argument is, and your foundation for making claims, the better your story is accepted, because your story matches the gross big data, rather than it being just an outlying story that some people will do. It's just a story with no backing, and the people don't know what to do with that. It's a very emotional story. It sounds good, but is it true? And the power, and I think the Wall Street Journal does it perfectly. They tell stories, and then boom, right behind it is the data.
Mm-hmm. Well, just to stay with you for one moment, to help wrap us up, what do you feel is an underreported story right now? And we'll just go around.
Mm-hmm.
Ted, what do you feel is a really underreported story right now?
Well, we're in Illinois where everything's broke, and the corruption is horrible, and all that, and finances are bad and all that. But I think, in the grand scheme of things, we got to get the culture right. Because if we don't get the culture right, nothing else really matters, right? Finances don't matter. A lot of things don't matter. So, I want to say that probably the most dangerous thing we have out there is that combination of critical race theory / I'll just leave it at critical race theory. And I think people don't know what it is. I was looking at the polls the other day that people have strong opinions on it if they know what it is. But a lot of people don't know. And I was looking at the stats. I think half of Democrats either know very little or nothing about it. And that means that they're not seeing the news. Of course, on the right side, they're all seeing it. And so, we've got to get beyond this point of all the arguments out loud and really get down to the nitty gritty of what it means and how's it going to impact our kids and our future. And so I think we need to do better reporting, less hyperbolic reporting, but more about fairness and freedom and, I guess kind of the MLK way of talking about things. I think that's the big thing that's going to play out over the next year and more.
Well, and this also seems like a great argument, not just for showing up at city council meetings and doing that kind of local beat reporting, but also showing up at school boards and talking to parents, talking to electeds. That kind of reporting, I feel, is there's a real missed opportunity right now. Albert, to you, particularly locally, what do you feel is an underreported story right now?
Well, I'll take a page from Ted's book, and I will say, Pennsylvania and Philadelphia specifically is going to go the way of Detroit with our pensions at some point in the next 10 to 20 years. And we have received a huge stimulus from the federal government 3 times over. What's happening with that money? Has it gone to shore up our retirement obligations, our long-term liabilities, and what is the sort of long-term fiscal future? Figuring out a way to storytell around that and make sure that we are centering the needs and wants of both future retirees who are planning on getting checks and the burdens that are going to fall upon people of my age range is very crucially important.
Jillian?
So I think we're living in a golden age of activism on both the left and the right. And one of my favorite things that a mentor taught me is any activist movement has its good people. It's also got its grifters. So if I were a young journalist starting out today, I would look into how to read nonprofit filings. I'd look into how to read PAC contributions and PAC spending, and look for self-funding, look for people who are using that activism to enrich themselves, because I think it's a great underreported story and you'll break news on it.
I think I saw Albert taking notes right there.
I've taken a few notes.
Jillian, Albert, Ted, it's been wonderful talking with you. To everyone watching us, please subscribe to their outlets and support their outlets as well. I'll also say please subscribe to the Manhattan Institute, City Journal. We also have an outlet in City Journal that does writes a lot of local stories too. We all exist in this world to help tell important stories, especially these underreported stories that you heard today. Please stay in touch with us, stay in touch with all of us here, and we look forward to seeing you on another MI virtual event cast soon. Thank you, everyone watching.
Thank you.
Thank you.